When you hear the name Joan of Arc, what's the first image that comes to mind? For most of us, it's a powerful, almost mythical scene. A young woman, defiant and serene, surrounded by flames. We see the martyr, the saint, the symbol of French courage. But this image, as dramatic as it is, skips over the most harrowing part of her story. The true horror of Joan of Arc's final days didn't start with the fire. It began long before, in the cold, damp darkness of a prison cell. This isn't just a story about a public execution. It's a story of systematic, psychological torment designed to break a person from the inside out. Forget the glorious battlefield victories for a moment. We need to talk about the stone walls, the iron chains, and the relentless pressure that defined her last months on Earth. This is the story of how Joan the Maid was unmade. After her capture by Burgundian forces in May 1430, Joan wasn't treated like a standard prisoner of war. She was a prize, a political hot potato. The English, who had been humiliated by her successes, wanted her more than anything. They saw her not as a soldier, but as a heretic, a witch whose supernatural aid was the only explanation for their defeats. After months of negotiations, the English paid a fortune for her 10,000 livres and brought her to Rouen, the heart of their power in France. She wasn't taken to a church prison, which would have been standard for a heresy trial and would have meant female guards. Instead, she was thrown into a secular military fortress, a dark tower cell. Her captors were English soldiers, men who saw her as their enemy. From the very beginning, the rules were broken, setting the stage for what was to come. Imagine being 19 years old, locked in a room, and your only human contact is with the very men you fought against. Joan was kept in leg irons, chained to a heavy wooden block to prevent any escape. She had tried to escape before, even leaping from a tower, so they took no chances. These chains weren't just for security. They were a constant, physical reminder of her powerlessness. Male guards were with her day and night, a deliberate violation of church law and a source of constant threat and humiliation for a young woman who had taken a vow of chastity. She had to eat, sleep, and exist under their constant gaze. The psychological pressure of this arrangement is almost impossible to imagine. It was an environment of pure intimidation. Her trial began in February 1431. But this was no fair court of law. It was a show trial, orchestrated by Bishop Pierre Cauchin, a French clergyman who was a staunch supporter of the English. His goal was not to find the truth, but to secure a conviction. The trial was a masterpiece of legal and theological manipulation. Over several months, Joan was subjected to dozens of interrogations, sometimes twice a day. The questions were like a labyrinth, filled with traps. Theologians, lawyers, and scholars, some of the sharpest minds in Europe, were assembled to grill this uneducated peasant girl. They asked her about the nature of her visions. Were her saints real? Did they have bodies, hair, clothes? Did God hate the English? Every answer was scrutinized, twisted, and recorded, searching for any slip-up, any statement that could be branded as heresy. Think about the sheer mental exhaustion. Joan had no lawyer, no advisor, no one to speak for her. It was her, alone, against a room full of powerful, educated men who had already decided her guilt. Yet, for weeks, she held her own with astounding wit and clarity. When they asked if she was in God's grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a brilliant answer to an impossible theological trap. Answering yes would be presumptuous, and answering no would be an admission of sin. For a time, her spirit seemed unbreakable. She corrected their Latin, parried their trick questions, and steadfastly refused to betray the nature of her visions, which she considered a sacred secret between her and God. She was fighting a new kind of war, a war of words and wits inside a suffocating room, but the pressure was relentless and multifaceted. They didn't just question her, they threatened her with torture. One day, they took her to the castle's torture chamber. They showed her the instruments, the rack, the boots, all the horrific tools designed to inflict unimaginable pain. They described what each one did, hoping the fear alone would be enough to make her confess. Joan, though visibly terrified, refused. She told them that even if they tore her limb from limb, she would not say anything different, and if she did, She would later say they forced it from her. She passed this test, but the psychological scar remained. The threat of physical agony was now a permanent resident in her mind. Another layer of fear on top of the isolation and mental exhaustion. The real breaking point, however, came down to something surprisingly simple: her clothes. Throughout her military campaign, Joan had worn men's clothing. For her, this was a practical material. It was better for riding and fighting, but it was also a symbol of her mission and a form of protection. For her accusers, it was the perfect weapon. Cross-dressing was explicitly forbidden by scripture and considered an abomination. They hammered on this point relentlessly. They told her that to save her soul, to be allowed to receive communion, she had to renounce her male attire and her visions. After months of confinement, of threats, of isolation, and facing the immediate prospect of being burned alive, Joan finally broke. On May 24, 1431, in a public ceremony, she signed a document of abjuration and confession. In it, she renounced her saints, her visions, and promised to wear women's clothes. Her life was spared. She was sentenced to life in prison, on bread and water. For a moment, it seemed she had chosen life, even a life in chains. But this was the final, most cruel deception. She was returned to prison, but now, stripped of her mission and forced into a dress, she was more vulnerable than ever. The accounts of what happened next are chilling. According to several witnesses who later testified at her rehabilitation trial, she was subjected to intense harassment and possibly assault by her English guards. They mocked her. They tried to tear the dress from her. The men's clothes she had worn were a shield, and now that shield was gone. A few days later, she was found once again wearing men's clothing. The judges descended on her cell immediately. Why had she done it? Her answer was heartbreaking. She said she did it to protect herself from the guards. She also declared that her voices had returned, telling her she had damned herself to save her life and had betrayed them. She took back her confession. This was exactly what Bishop Cauchin and the English had been waiting for. By relapsing into her so-called heresy wearing men's clothes again, she had sealed her fate. There would be no more chances. She was a relapsed heretic, and the only punishment for that was death. There was no new trial, just a swift condemnation. The moment she put those clothes back on, whether out of defiance or desperation, her death warrant was signed. The entire process, the confession, the brief reprieve, the relapse feels like a calculated trap. They gave her a sliver of hope, then put her in a situation where she would inevitably break the terms, giving them the perfect legal justification to execute her. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old market square in Rouen. She was 19 years old. As she was tied to the stake, she asked for a cross. An English soldier, perhaps moved by a moment of pity, fashioned a small one for her from 2 pieces of wood. She kissed it and placed it inside her dress. A priest also brought a crucifix from a nearby church and held it up for her to see as the flames were lit. Her final moments were not silent or serene. Eyewitnesses reported that she cried out for Jesus repeatedly until the smoke and fire consumed her. To ensure no one could claim she had escaped, the English raked back the coals to show her charred body to the crowd before burning it 2 more times, reducing it to ash. Her remains were then gathered and thrown into the Seine River. The goal was total annihilation, to leave no relics, no trace for her followers to rally around. The story of Joan of Arc is so much more than her martyrdom. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it's also a terrifying look at how institutions can use fear, isolation, and psychological manipulation to crush an individual. They couldn't defeat her on the battlefield, so they trapped her in a cell and waged a different kind of war. They attacked her mind, her faith, and her identity until they finally found a crack. While we remember the fire, it's crucial to remember the cold stone cell, the heavy chains, and the lonely, terrifying days that came before. That is where the true battle for Joan's soul was fought, and depending on how you look at it, where she may have achieved her most profound victory by ultimately refusing to be anyone but herself. Thank you so much for watching. If you found the story as compelling as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to fall from the absolute pinnacle of glory to the depths of despair? Imagine being a national hero, a savior, the one who turned the tide of a war that had raged for nearly a century, and then, in a single moment, it all gets stripped away. This isn't a fictional story. This is the harrowing tale of Joan of Arc's final moments of freedom. The year is 1430. The 100 Years' War is still tearing France apart. Joan, the young peasant girl who claimed divine guidance, has achieved the impossible. She's lifted the siege of Orleans, led the French army to a series of stunning victories, and stood beside Charles VII as he was crowned King of France in Reims. She is, by all accounts, a living legend. Her banner, emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary, is a symbol of hope and divine favor. French soldiers follow her with unwavering loyalty, believing she is truly sent by God. Her enemies, the English and their Burgundian allies, fear her, whispering that she's a witch, a heretic, a tool of the devil. But the momentum of war is a fickle thing. After the coronation of Charles, the political landscape grew complicated. The French court was divided. Some, like Joan, wanted to press the advantage and drive the English out of France for good, marching all the way to Paris. Others, more cautious and politically minded, favored negotiation and diplomacy with the Duke of Burgundy, who was allied with England. This internal conflict stalled the French war effort. Joan found herself frustrated, her divine mission hampered by courtly intrigue and indecision. Driven by her unyielding conviction, Joan continued to fight, but without the full, unified support of the king and his court she once had. This brings us to May 23rd, 1430, outside the walls of the town of Compiègne. The town was loyal to King Charles, but it was under siege by a powerful Burgundian army led by Joan of Luxembourg. Defending Compiègne was crucial. If it fell, the path to the heart of France would be wide open for the enemy. Joan, the warrior, couldn't stand by. She led a small force of a few hundred soldiers and rushed to the town's defense. On that fateful afternoon, she decided to lead a sortie surprise, attack against a Burgundian encampment on the far side of the Oise River. It was a bold, risky maneuver, typical of Joan's aggressive military style. She was trying to break the siege before it could fully take hold. As she and her men charged across the causeway, they initially caught the Burgundians by surprise. There was a fierce skirmish, a chaotic clash of steel and shouting. For a moment, it seemed like her trademark audacity might pay off once again. But the Burgundians were numerous and well prepared. They quickly recovered and mounted a massive counter. The small French force was overwhelmed, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They were forced into a desperate retreat back towards the safety of Compiègne's walls. This is where the tragedy unfolds. Joan was always known for leading from the front, but also for being the last to retreat, ensuring her soldiers made it to safety. She was the rear guard, placing herself in the most dangerous position. As her men scrambled back across the causeway, the tide of the battle turned against her completely. An English force, alerted by the commotion, arrived to reinforce the Burgundians, cutting off the path of retreat. Panic set in. The governor of Compiègne, fearing that the enemy would follow the retreating soldiers into the town and capture it, made a devastating decision. He ordered the drawbridge to be raised and the gates to be shut. It was a brutal act of military necessity, saving the town but sealing the fate of those left outside. Joan was one of them. Imagine the scene. Joan, on her horse, fighting valiantly, trying to rally her remaining men, suddenly realizes she's trapped. The path to safety is gone. The gate is closed. She is surrounded. Burgundian soldiers, a mix of archers and men-at-arms, closed in on her. An archer from Picardy, loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, managed to grab hold of her flowing gold-cloth surcoat and pull her from her horse. She hit the ground hard. In an instant, the Maid of Orleans, the symbol of French defiance, was a captive. There was no grand, heroic last stand. It was a frantic, desperate scramble in the mud and chaos of a battlefield. Her own brother and a few loyal guards fought to protect her, but they were quickly subdued. She was surrounded by enemy faces, their expressions a mix of triumph, greed, and awe. They knew exactly who they had just captured. This wasn't just any prisoner. This was the witch, the sorceress who had haunted their nightmares. For the Burgundians, it was the prize of a lifetime. The ransom for a figure like Joan would be astronomical. She was immediately taken to the camp of Joan of Luxembourg. The girl who had commanded armies was now a prisoner, her freedom gone in the blink of an eye. There was no respect for her past victories, no mercy for her youth. She was a trophy of war. The news of her capture spread like wildfire. For the English and Burgundians, it was a cause for massive celebration. They believed that by capturing her, they had broken the spell she held over the French. They saw it as proof that God was not, in fact, on her side. For the French, it was a catastrophic blow. The morale of the soldiers plummeted. Their divine champion had been taken. How could this have happened? You might expect King Charles VII, the man she had crowned, to leap into action, to do everything in his power to rescue her or ransom her. But he didn't. The French court remained strangely passive. Negotiations for her release were slow and half-hearted. Historians debate the reasons why, to this day. Was it political jealousy? Was Joan becoming too powerful, too popular for the king's comfort? Or was it simply that the French treasury was empty, and they couldn't afford the massive ransom demanded 10,000 livres sternos? The king's ransom, literally. Whatever the reason, Joan was abandoned. She was passed from one Burgundian castle to another, always under heavy guard. She made several desperate escape attempts, even jumping from a 70-foot tower at one point. A fall that left her injured but alive. Her spirit was unbroken, but her situation was hopeless. Eventually, the English, who wanted her more than anyone, struck a deal. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, pro-English churchman, orchestrated her sale from the Burgundians to the English. The English didn't just want her locked away. They wanted to destroy her reputation, to prove she was a heretic and a fraud, thereby invalidating Charles VII's coronation and legitimizing their own claim to the French throne. And so, Joan of Arc, the soldier and savior, was handed over to her deadliest enemies. Her capture at Compiègne was the beginning of the end. It led directly to her infamous trial for heresy in Rouen, a sham trial controlled by her political enemies. It led to her condemnation and, ultimately, to her execution by burning at the stake in May of 1431, almost exactly 1 year after she was pulled from her horse. The story of Joan's capture is a brutal reminder of the realities of war and politics. A hero one day can be a prisoner the next. It shows how quickly fortunes can change and how even the most extraordinary individuals can fall victim to betrayal, jealousy, and political maneuvering. The closed gate at Compiègne wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of her abandonment by the very people she had fought to save. Her brief, brilliant career as a warrior was over, and her journey toward martyrdom had begun. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history fascinating, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the past to life. Let us know in the comments what you think about the controversial decision to close the gates on Joan. See you next time. Perhaps the most painful betrayal came next. Instead of being held honorably as a prisoner of war, Juan was sold, literally exchanged for money. The Burgundians, her initial captors, handed her over to the English for 10,000 francs. This was a staggering sum, the king's ransom. But it wasn't a ransom. This was a purchase. And this single act tells you everything you need to know about what was to come. The normal rules of war, the chivalric code that supposedly governed medieval conflict, were thrown out the window. The English didn't want to exchange her for one of their own captured nobles. They didn't want to negotiate her release. They wanted to destroy her. Think about that for a moment. This teenage girl, who had led armies and crowned a king, was now a commodity. A political pawn to be used and discarded. She wasn't facing soldiers on a battlefield anymore, where courage and strategy could win the day. She was facing something far more insidious. A calculated campaign of character assassination. The English goal wasn't just to kill her. It was to erase her. They needed to prove that her visions were not from God, but from the devil. They needed to discredit not just Joan, but the king she had crowned, Charles VII. If Joan was a heretic, then Charles's crown was illegitimate, a gift from a witch. The entire French cause, which he had so brilliantly revived, would crumble. So, Joan was transferred to Rouen, a city deep in English-controlled territory. And there, she wasn't kept in a church prison, under the custody of nuns, which would have been the proper procedure for someone accused of heresy. No, she was thrown into a secular military prison, a dark, cold stone tower. She was guarded day and night by rough English soldiers, a constant, terrifying threat. This was deliberate. It was a strategy of intimidation and humiliation, designed to break her spirit before the trial even began. They took away her male clothing, which she wore for protection, and tried to force her into a dress, making her vulnerable. Every aspect of her captivity was designed to strip away her identity as a soldier of God and reduce her to a frightened, powerless girl. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of legal and political manipulation. It was a show trial, in every sense of the word. The court was stacked with pro-English clergy and theologians, led by a man named Pierre Couchin, the Bishop of Beauvais. Couchin was a politically ambitious man who had been driven from his own diocese by Joan's forces. He had a personal vendetta. He was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury, all rolled into one. The deck was stacked so high against Joan, it was practically vertical. She had no legal counsel, no one to advise her. She was alone, a 19-year-old peasant girl, facing dozens of the most educated and cunning men in Europe. And yet, she fought back. The transcripts of her trial are one of the most remarkable documents of the Middle Ages. They show a young woman of incredible intelligence, wit, and unwavering faith. The learned doctors and theologians tried to trap her with complex theological questions, legal paradoxes, and loaded inquiries. They asked her if she was in a state of grace. This was a classic trap. If she said yes, she'd be guilty of presumption, as the church taught that no one could be certain of their state of grace. If c'est ça, no, she'd be admitting she was a sinner. Her now famous reply stunned the court into silence. She said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a brilliant answer, humble and pious, and it completely sidestepped their trap. Time and again, she outmaneuvered them. They questioned her about her saints, Catherine and Margaret. They tried to make her describe them in detail, hoping to catch her in a contradiction or an absurdity. She refused to be drawn into their games, stating that her visions were for her and the King of France, not for them. They pressed her on why she wore men's clothes, a key part of their heresy charge. She explained it was for practicality and protection in a military camp and now in a prison full of male guards. Her answers were direct, honest, and often disarmingly simple. She cut through their legal jargon and theological hair-splitting with plain truth. She repeatedly corrected the court notary when he misquoted her, showing she was paying attention to every single word. Despite her incredible bravery, the outcome was never in doubt. The trial dragged on for months, a grueling process of psychological warfare. They wore her down with endless interrogations, threats of torture, and the sheer misery of her confinement. They were determined to get a confession, to get her to recant, to admit her voices were demonic. Finally, under immense pressure, and possibly after a false promise of being moved to a church prison, she signed a document of abjuration. We don't know exactly what she signed or if she understood it. It was likely read to her in French, but the official record was in Latin. In it, she supposedly renounced her visions and agreed to wear women's clothes. For a moment, it seemed they had won. They had broken her. They sentenced her to life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. A few days later, the judges returned to her cell to find her once again in men's clothing. Why? The accounts differ. Some say her dress was taken away, forcing her to wear the male clothes. Joan herself said that she had been tricked, that she had never intended to deny her saints. She understood now that by recanting, she would be damning her own soul to save her body, and that was a price she was not willing to pay. She chose God over her captors. For the court, this was the final nail in the coffin. She was a relapsed heretic. Betrayal. There was no longer any hope for her soul. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the old marketplace in Rouen. She was 19 years old. As she was tied to the stake, she asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by her plea, quickly fashioned a small one out of 2 pieces of wood and gave it to her. She held it close. She asked a priest to hold a crucifix up high so she could see it as the flames rose. Her last reported words were a cry to Jesus. The English weren't content with just burning her. They raked back the coals to show the crowd that she had not escaped, that she was truly dead. Then they burned her body a second and a third time, until nothing was left but ashes, which they gathered and threw into the Seine River. They wanted to ensure there would be no body, no relics for people to venerate. They wanted to wipe every physical trace of Joan of Arc from the face of the earth. But they failed. In trying to destroy her memory, They immortalized her. The injustice of her trial and the cruelty of her death turned a soldier into a martyr, and a martyr into a legend. Years later, when the tide of the war had turned decisively in France's favor, King Charles VII, the very king she had crowned, authorized a new trial. This wasn't just about clearing Joan's name. It was about validating his own kingship. The retrial, held in the 1450s, meticulously examined the evidence from the first one. It interviewed surviving witnesses. The conclusion was unanimous and overwhelming. The original verdict was nullified. Joan was declared innocent, a martyr who had been wrongly executed by a biased, politically motivated court. But her story transcended even that official vindication. Joan became a symbol of French nationalism, of courage in the face of impossible odds, and of faith that could move mountains. Her story has inspired countless books, plays, films, and works of art. Nearly 500 years after she was burned at the stake, in 1920, the same institution that had condemned her, the Catholic Church, officially canonized her as a saint. The peasant girl, who was sold for money, tried as a heretic, and executed as a witch, is now Saint Joan of Arc, one of the patron saints of France. Her legacy proves that you can burn a body, you can scatter the ashes, but you can never extinguish a powerful idea. You can never truly kill a spirit that has captured the imagination of the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as compelling as we do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the most fascinating moments in history. See you next time. Imagine a story so powerful it changes the course of history, not with a crown or a scepter, but with a sword and unwavering faith. This is the story of Joan of Arc, the farm girl who led an army. But our story today isn't about her glorious victories on the battlefield. It's about her darkest days, the chapter that tested her spirit more than any battle ever could. Her imprisonment in Rouen. After a series of stunning military triumphs that turned the tide of the 100 Years' War for France, Joan's luck ran out. Captured by Burgundian forces and sold to their English allies, she was taken to the city of Rouen. This wasn't just any city. It was the heart of English power in France, a hostile stronghold. For Joan, it was the lion's den. Now, picture this. When a woman in the 15th century was accused of heresy, of crimes against the church, the standard procedure was to place her in a church prison. She'd be held in a convent or a dedicated cell overseen by nuns. The idea was to offer a space for reflection, penance, and the salvation of her soul. It was a system designed, at least on paper, to be corrective, not purely punitive. This was the law. This was the expectation. But for Joan, the rules were thrown out the window. She wasn't led to a quiet convent. She wasn't handed over to the care of nuns. Instead, she was dragged to a secular, military fortress, the castle of Rouen. Forget quiet contemplation. Think cold, damp stone, and the clank of iron. She was thrown into a dark cell, a place not for saving souls, but for breaking spirits. This single decision, to place her in a military prison instead of an ecclesiastical one, tells us everything we need to know about the intentions of her captors. This was never about a fair religious trial. It was a political maneuver from the very start, designed to crush the symbol of French resistance. Inside this fortress, her reality was grim. She was a young woman, barely 19, surrounded by rough, hardened English soldiers. Her guards were not gentle clergymen, but men who saw her as the enemy, a witch, a freak of nature who had defeated their armies. The threat was constant and palpable. She was kept in irons, chained by the neck, hands, and feet to a heavy wooden block. At night, a heavy iron chain was stretched across her body and locked, making any movement a struggle. She was never alone, with multiple guards inside her cell at all times, day and night. This intense, suffocating surveillance had a specific purpose. One of the main charges against her was that she wore men's clothing. To her, this was a practical necessity on the battlefield and, crucially, a form of protection in prison. Surrounded by male guards, her soldier's attire was her only shield against potential assault. Her captors knew this. They repeatedly tried to force her into a dress, not out of concern for religious propriety, but to make her vulnerable, to break her resolve, and to trick her into relapsing into the sin of cross-dressing, which would seal her fate. This brings us to the trial. Itself, it was a masterclass in political theater, disguised as a religious inquiry. The man leading the charge was Pierre Cauchin, the Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchin was a Frenchman, but his loyalties lay firmly with the English, who had promised him power and position. He assembled a court of theologians and lawyers, many of whom were on the English payroll or were intimidated into compliance. It was a stacked deck. The verdict was decided before the first question was ever asked. The trial began in February 1431 and lasted 4 months. It was a grueling psychological battle. Joan, an uneducated peasant girl who couldn't read or write, faced off against a room full of the most educated and cunning legal minds in the country. They grilled her relentlessly, day after day, on complex theological doctrines, trying to trap her in her own words. They asked her trick questions, like, "Are you in a state of God's grace?" It was a classic trap. If she said yes, she'd be guilty of presumption, as no one can truly know that. If she said no, she'd be admitting her own guilt. Her legendary response stunned the court. She replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was an answer so brilliant, so filled with simple faith and sharp wit, that it left her accuser speechless. Time and again, she parried their complex questions with disarming honesty and unwavering conviction. She recounted her visions of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret with such clarity and passion that it unnerved the court. They wanted a heretic, but they found a girl with unshakable faith. Frustrated by her resilience, her captors resorted to threats and deception. They took her to the castle's torture chamber, showing her the horrific instruments, hoping the sight alone would break her. It didn't. She calmly stated that even if they tore her limb from limb, she would not change her testimony. Her spirit, it seemed, was unbreakable. But the physical and psychological toll was immense. Months in a dark cell, constant interrogations, lack of proper food, and the ever-present threat of violence wore her down. Finally, in a moment of extreme weakness, facing the stake, she faltered. On May 24th, at a public cemetery, with the executioner waiting, she signed a document of abjuration and confession. In it, she renounced her visions and promised to stop wearing men's clothes. Her life was spared, but she was sentenced to life in prison. For a brief moment, her captors had won. They had broken the Maid of Orleans. She was put into a dress and taken back to prison. But what happened next is the most poignant part of her story. Accounts differ, but the most common one is that her male clothing was left in her cell, perhaps deliberately. A few days later, she was found once again dressed as a soldier. When asked why, she gave a heartbreaking reason. She explained that her guards had attempted to assault her, and her male attire was her only defense. More importantly, she declared that her visions were true, that God had indeed spoken to her, and that she had damned her soul by denying them out of fear. This was exactly what Cauchin and the English were waiting for. By that twisted logic, she had relapsed into heresy. The trap had been sprung. There would be no more chances, no more mercy. The verdict was swift. Joan of Arc was declared a relapsed heretic and sentenced to death by burning. On May 30th, 1431, just days after her confession, Joan was led to the old marketplace in Rouen. She was just 19 years old. As she walked to the stake, she asked for a cross. A kind English soldier fashioned one for her from 2 pieces of wood, which she clutched to her chest. She was tied to a tall pillar, high above the crowd, so everyone could see. As the flames rose, her final words were not of hatred or fear, but a prayer. She called out the name of Jesus over and over until the smoke and fire consumed her. Many in the crowd, including some of the English soldiers, were openly weeping. They had come to see a witch burn, but they witnessed the martyrdom of a saint. An English secretary famously remarked, "We are all lost, for we have burned a good and holy person." In their attempt to extinguish her light, they had instead created an eternal flame. They wanted to erase her from history, but in that marketplace in Rouen they ensured she would be remembered forever. Her strength in that dark prison, her defiance in that rigged courtroom, and her faith at the stake became a legend that would inspire France to finally drive out the English and crown their king, just as she had prophesied. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as moving as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most incredible moments in history. See you next time. Have you ever heard of Joan of Arc? Not just the legend, but the real young woman behind the myth. Imagine this. You're just a teenager, barely an adult, and you believe with all your heart that you've been chosen for a divine mission. You lead an army, you crown a king, and you become a symbol of hope for your entire nation. It sounds like a fairy tale, right? But for Joan, this incredible journey took a dark and terrifying turn. After her capture, the dream became a nightmare. The reality of her final days is far more harrowing than most people know. It's a story of faith, courage, and unimaginable cruelty. Let's step back into the year 1431. Joan, the celebrated Maid of Orleans, is no longer on the battlefield. She's a prisoner, sold to the English, her sworn enemies. Her trial is a sham, a political maneuver disguised as a religious inquiry. But it's her imprisonment that truly reveals the depth of the cruelty she faced. Forget any notions of a noble prisoner in a high tower. Joan's reality was a cold, dark cell in a secular castle, not a church prison where she might have found some small comfort or protection. This detail is crucial. It meant she was under the control of soldiers, not clergy. Picture this. She's locked away, a young woman of 19, surrounded day and night by rough, hardened male guards. The sources say there were 5 of them inside her cell at all times. 3 inside, and 2 outside the door. They were English soldiers who saw her not as a visionary, but as an enemy, a witch, a freak. Her every move was watched. There was no privacy, no moment of peace. This was a calculated strategy of psychological torment. Joan was a devout young woman from a small village, raised with a strong sense of modesty and piety. The constant presence of these men was a profound violation of her beliefs and her very being. It was designed to break her spirit, to humiliate her, to make her feel utterly alone and vulnerable. And then there was the physical restraint. Joan was kept in irons, not just simple manacles, but a heavy chain locked around her waist, attached to a large wooden beam in the cell. Her feet were also shackled, day and night. Think about that. Even when she slept, she was bound. She couldn't move freely, couldn't find a comfortable position, couldn't escape the cold, hard reality of her captivity. Every clink of the chains was a reminder of her powerlessness. This wasn't just about preventing escape, it was about crushing her will. Her captors wanted to strip away her dignity, piece by piece, hoping she would confess to anything just to make it stop. The psychological pressure was immense. The judges, a panel of pro-English theologians, would visit her in her cell, interrogating her for hours on end. They twisted her words, trying to trap her in theological knots she couldn't possibly understand. They questioned her visions, mocked her faith, and threatened her with torture. Imagine being 19, exhausted, chained, and having to verbally spar with some of the most educated men in Europe, all of whom have already decided you're guilty. They wanted her to deny her voices, to say that God had not sent her. For Joan, this was unthinkable. Her mission, her entire identity, was built on the truth of those divine messages. Denying them would be like denying her own soul. They offered her a twisted deal. If she would put on a dress, abandoning the male clothing she wore for protection, and as a symbol of her mission, they might move her to a church prison. It sounds like a small thing, but for Joan, it was everything. Her male attire was a command from her saints. It also offered a practical layer of protection against assault in a cell full of soldiers. To change clothes would be to disobey God and surrender her last defense. So she refused, clinging to her principles, even as the walls closed in around her. The pressure cooker was getting hotter and hotter. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of her ordeal was the complete isolation from any form of spiritual comfort. As a deeply religious person, the sacraments were her lifeline, but her captors denied her the chance to attend Mass or receive communion. They cut her off from the very source of her strength and resilience. They wanted her to feel abandoned, not just by people, but by her God. Yet, through it all, she held on. Her faith, which they tried so hard to break, became her unbreakable shield. In her own words, from the trial transcripts, she responded to their threats with incredible courage, telling them that even if they burned her, her voices would still be with her in the flames. The trial dragged on for months. Joan, weary and malnourished, never wavered in her core beliefs. She answered their complex questions with a simple, disarming honesty that often left them speechless. When asked if she was in God's grace, a trick question designed to damn her either way, she famously replied, "If I am not, May God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. Who could argue with that? Her spirit, it seemed, was indomitable, but her body was weak, and her enemies were relentless. They knew they couldn't win a fair fight, so they cheated. Finally, under immense duress, and possibly a false promise, she signed a document of abjuration, a confession of sorts. It's unclear if she even knew what she was signing. She was promised life in a church prison if she did. But it was a lie. They took her back to the same cell, with the same guards, and forced her back into women's clothing. Accounts from the time suggest she was then assaulted by an English lord. A final, brutal act of violation. In defiance and despair, she put her male clothes back on. This was exactly what her accusers were waiting for. They declared her a relapsed heretic. The trap had been sprung. Her fate was sealed. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen and burned at the stake. She was just 19 years old. As the flames rose, she repeatedly called out the name of Jesus. She asked for a cross, and a soldier fashioned a small one from 2 sticks, which she held to her chest. Even in her final moments, surrounded by a jeering crowd and consumed by fire, her faith was her only focus. It's a scene of almost unbearable tragedy, the final act in a campaign of systematic cruelty. Joan's story doesn't end in the ashes. 25 years later, a new trial was held. Her conviction was overturned, and she was declared a martyr. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint, but it's vital we remember the human being behind the sainthood, a terrified but resolute young woman, chained in a dark room, who faced down the most powerful men of her time with nothing but her conviction. Her story is not just about victory on the battlefield. It's about the incredible strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to keep going despite it. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark final days of Joan of Arc. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. See you next time.